Mr. Happy by Roger Hargreaves. On the other side of the world, where the sun shines hotter than here, and where the trees are 100 feet tall, there's a country called Happy Land. Everybody who lives in Happy Land is happy all day long. Wherever you go, you see happy, smiling faces all around. It's such a happy place that even the flowers seem to smile in Happy Land. And, as well as all the people being happy, all the animals in Happy Land are happy as well. If you've never seen a mouse smile, or a cat, or a dog, or even a worm, go to Happy Land. This is a story about someone who lived there who happened to be called Mr. Happy. Mr. Happy was fat and round and happy. One day, while Mr. Happy was walking through the woods, he came across something quite unusual. There, in the trunk of one of the very tall trees, was a door. Not a very large door, but nevertheless a door. Certainly a door. A small, narrow, yellow door. Definitely a door.
I wonder who lives here,
thought Mr. Happy to himself. And he turned the knob of that small, narrow, yellow door. The door wasn't locked, and it swung open quite easily. Just inside the small, narrow, yellow door was a small, narrow, winding staircase leading downwards. Mr. Happy squeezed his rather large body through the rather thin doorway and began to walk down the stairs. The stairs went round and round and down and down and round and down and down and round. Eventually, after a long time, Mr. Happy reached the bottom of the staircase. He looked around and saw, there in front of him, another small, narrow door, but this one was red. Mr. Happy knocked at the door.
Who's there?
Said a voice. A sad, squeaky sort of voice.
Who's there?
Mr. Happy pushed open the red door slowly, and there, sitting on a stool, was somebody who looked exactly like Mr. Happy, except that he didn't look happy at all. In fact, he looked downright miserable.
Hello,
said Mr. Happy.
I'm Mr. Happy.
Oh, sniffed the person who looked like Mr. Happy but wasn't.
Well, my name is Mr. Miserable, and I'm the most miserable person in the world.
Why are you so miserable? Asked Mr. Happy.
Because I am,
replied Mr. Miserable. Mr. Happy thought.
How would you like to be happy like me?
Asked Mr. Happy.
I'd give anything to be happy,
said Mr. Miserable.
But I'm so miserable, I don't think I could ever be happy,
he added miserably. Mr. Happy made up his mind quickly.
Follow me,
he said.
Where to?
Asked Mr. Miserable.
Don't argue,
said Mr. Happy, and he went out through the small, narrow red door. Mr. Miserable hesitated and then followed. Up and up the winding staircase they went. Up and up and round and round and up and round and round and up until they came out into the woods.
Follow me,
said Mr. Happy again, and they both went through the woods back to Mr. Happy's cottage. Mr. Miserable stayed in Mr. Happy's cottage for quite some time, and during that time the most remarkable thing happened. Because he was living in Happyland, Mr. Miserable ever so slowly stopped being miserable and started being happy. His mouth stopped turning down at the corners. And ever so slowly it started turning up at the corners. And eventually, Mr. Miserable did something that he had never done before in his life. He smiled, and then he chuckled, which turned into a giggle, which became a laugh, a big, booming, hearty, huge, giant, large, enormous laugh. And Mr. Happy was so surprised that he started to laugh too. And both of them laughed and laughed. They laughed until their sides hurt and their eyes watered. Mr. Miserable and Mr. Happy laughed and laughed and laughed and laughed. And because they were laughing so much, everybody who saw them started laughing as well. Even the birds in the trees started to laugh at the thought of somebody called Mr. Miserable who couldn't stop laughing. And that's the end of the story, except to say that if you ever feel as miserable as Mr. Miserable used to, you know exactly what to do, don't you? Just turn your mouth up at the corners. Go on.
Happy is feeling good. Happy is loving you. Happy is knocking on wood, 'cause you feel about me like you do. Happy is a wonderful feeling I get, 'cause I know you'll always be around me. When I see you smile on your sunny face, then happiness surrounds me. Happy is feeling fine.
Happy's a dream to share.
I'm happy most of the time, 'cause I know that you are always there.
And whenever blues appear, they don't last, they disappear from view.
'Cause happy is feeling good. I'm happy just loving you.
Happy is the wonderful feeling I get, 'cause I know you'll always be around me.
When I see you smile on your sunny face, then happiness surrounds me. Happy is feeling fine.
Happy's a dream to share.
I'm happy most of the time, 'cause I know that you are all